He was humiliated, shoved into the back of a police car like a criminal. But when the same cops walked into court, expecting an easy win, they came face to face with their worst mistake. The man they arrested was the judge deciding their fate. The sun hung high in the sky, casting sharp shadows on the bustling streets below. The city was alive, cars honking, vendors calling out to pedestrians, the distant hum of conversations blending into the chaotic symphony of the afternoon. Among the sea of people moving through the sidewalks, a man in a tailored navy blue suit walked with quiet confidence. His stride was unhurried, deliberate. In one hand he carried a sleek leather briefcase. The other remained tucked into his pocket. He wasn't an attention seeker. He had spent years mastering the art of blending in. To the world around him, he was just another professional heading to an important meeting. His presence was composed, dignified, but beneath the calm exterior was a mind constantly analyzing, observing, anticipating. A barista at a nearby cafe, wiping down a table near the window, glanced up just in time to see the man pass by. Something about him made the young worker pause. He couldn't explain why, but there was an air of authority in the way the man carried himself. It wasn't arrogance, nor was it intimidation. It was quiet power. But before he could dwell on it, a sharp whistle from the kitchen pulled him back to reality, and the moment passed. Across the street, two uniformed officers leaned against their patrol car, scanning the crowd. Officer Mitchell, a man in his late 40s with a hardened jaw and narrowed eyes, nudged his younger partner, Officer Harris. "You see that guy?" Mitchell muttered, nodding toward the well-dressed man walking calmly through the crowd. Harris squinted. "What about him?" "He matches the description," Mitchell said, his voice low, decisive. "Black male, navy suit, carrying a bag. Could be our guy from this morning's robbery." Harris hesitated. "I don't know, man. He doesn't look." Mitchell scoffed. "They never do. That's why they get away with it." Harris didn't argue. He was new to the force, still finding his footing. He had seen Mitchell make calls like this before, acting with an unwavering certainty that left no room for debate. And if there was one thing he had learned quickly, it was that questioning your superior, especially in front of an audience, was a fast way to lose credibility. The officers straightened, stepping into the street just as the man reached the next crosswalk. The pedestrian signal turned green, and the flow of people surged forward. Mitchell moved first. "Hey, stop right there." The man paused mid-step, turning his head slightly toward the voice. His eyes met Mitchell's, unreadable, calm. "I said stop." Mitchell's hand hovered near his holster as he and Harris closed the distance. The surrounding crowd instinctively slowed, eyes flickering toward the brewing confrontation. "I don't believe we've met, officers," the man said smoothly, his voice steady, controlled. "Is there a problem?" Mitchell didn't respond immediately. He was used to people reacting with panic, frustration, or defensiveness. But this man wasn't nervous. He wasn't challenging either, just composed. Harris cleared his throat. "We need to see some identification." "May I ask why?" Mitchell exhaled sharply. "You match the description of a suspect from an incident earlier today." The man tilted his head slightly, an almost imperceptible shift in posture. "And what description is that exactly?" Mitchell's patience thinned. "Black male, dark suit, carrying a bag." A beat of silence. A woman in the crowd, standing near the cafe window, frowned slightly. She had been following the exchange, her grip tightening around her shopping bag. "That's not much of a description," the man finally said, his lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. It sounds like you just described half the businessmen in this city. Mitchell's jaw clenched. Are you refusing to cooperate? The man held his gaze for a long moment, then sighed softly, reaching into his inner pocket. Harris instinctively tensed, but the man's movements were slow, deliberate. He pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a sleek black ID card. For the briefest moment, Harris's brows knit together as he read the name. Something about it felt familiar, but before he could piece it together, Mitchell snatched the ID, barely glancing at it before shoving it back into the man's chest. Hands behind your back. A flicker of something passed through the man's eyes, something too fast for either officer to catch. But he didn't resist. He merely exhaled, nodding slightly as if making a note of something. Mitchell grabbed his wrist, snapping cold metal cuffs around them. The crowd watched in silence, some recording on their phones. A man in a business suit, restrained like a criminal. A young woman standing near the scene caught a glimpse of his ID before it disappeared into his pocket. Her eyes widened slightly. She knew that name, and so would they. Soon enough. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrists as Officer Mitchell tightened them with unnecessary force. The weight of countless eyes burned into his back, but he remained still, his expression unreadable. Around him, the city buzzed with a different kind of energy now. Unease, curiosity, silent judgment. Harris hesitated for the briefest moment before moving to assist. Something about this didn't sit right, but Mitchell was already shoving the man forward. "Let's go," Mitchell barked, his grip firm, his authority absolute. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathered crowd. A woman with her phone raised took a step closer. "He didn't even resist," she muttered under her breath. Mitchell shot her a glare, his hand instinctively brushing against the baton on his belt. She didn't say another word, but the camera kept rolling. The man in the suit walked calmly, his movements precise, controlled. He didn't struggle, didn't plead. If anything, there was a strange patience in his eyes, as if he were observing something inevitable unfold. "Get in the car," Mitchell ordered, opening the back door of the patrol vehicle. The man stepped in, without a word. Harris hesitated before closing the door behind him, his fingers tightening around the handle. There was something about that name, something he couldn't shake. Mitchell, however, was unmoved. "We're taking him in." At the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the holding cells. The man in the navy blue suit sat on the bench, his posture relaxed, as if this were nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. Across the room, Mitchell leaned against the desk, scrolling through his phone while waiting for someone to process the paperwork. Harris sat beside him, staring at the arrest report, still unsettled. "Hey," Harris muttered, nudging Mitchell's arm. "We never ran his ID." Mitchell exhaled sharply, barely glancing up. "Why does it matter?" "He fits the description. Let him sit there for a while." Harris frowned but said nothing. He turned to his computer, typing in the man's name. The loading bar flickered, and then his stomach dropped. Judge Malcolm Carter. His breath hitched as he stared at the screen. There was no mistake. The man they had just arrested wasn't just any lawyer or businessman. He was a sitting judge. And not just any judge. A federal judge with a reputation for being sharp, ruthless, and unshakable in the courtroom. Harris felt a cold sweat creeping up his spine. Mitchell noticed his partner's sudden silence and leaned over. "What?" Harris turned the screen toward him. Mitchell's smirk faded instantly. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, his fingers tightening around his phone. A slow realization dawned on him, but it was already too late. A voice broke the silence. "You might want to call your superior." Both officers turned. Judge Carter stood at the bars of the holding cell, his expression still calm, but there was something else now, an undeniable weight in his gaze. Mitchell swallowed hard. You should have said something," he snapped, grasping for control. Judge Carter simply raised an eyebrow. "And would you have listened?" The air between them tightened. Harris shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing through possible outcomes. Mitchell wasn't panicking, not yet, but his jaw was tight and his fingers twitched. A door opened somewhere down the hall. Footsteps. A commanding presence entered the room. The station's captain. His eyes landed on Carter, then on Mitchell and Harris. The silence that followed was suffocating. "Let him out," the captain ordered, his voice clipped, cold. Mitchell opened his mouth, but the captain's glare silenced him before he could speak. The key turned in the lock. The door swung open. Judge Carter stepped out, smoothing his suit jacket. He adjusted his cuffs, now free of steel restraints, and met Mitchell's gaze. "For the record," he said evenly, "I expected better." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps and the sinking realization that the worst was yet to come. Mitchell stood frozen, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. His grip on the empty handcuffs tightened before he shoved them back into his belt. Harris, still seated, exhaled slowly, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as if he could somehow delete what had just happened. Judge Malcolm Carter had walked out of the precinct without another word, his measured footsteps echoing through the halls like the ticking of a countdown clock. Neither of them knew exactly when the hammer would fall, but they knew it would. "You think he'll let this go?" Harris asked quietly. Mitchell didn't answer. He already knew the truth. 3 days later, the courtroom was packed. The wooden benches were filled with journalists, local activists, and officers from the department, some whispering amongst themselves, others anxiously glancing at the doors. A few police officials sat stiffly in the gallery, their eyes darting around the room like they were waiting for an explosion. Mitchell adjusted his tie with shaky fingers, his usual arrogance replaced with an unfamiliar weight in his chest. He had been through court proceedings before, but never like this. Never sitting at the defendant's table. Beside him, Harris looked worse. His face was pale, his shoulders stiff. Then the bailiff spoke. "All rise." The entire room stood in unison. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and the judge entered. Judge Malcolm Carter. He moved with the same quiet confidence as before, his black robes flowing behind him as he ascended the bench. But this time, there was no briefcase, no anonymity. This time, he held the gavel. Mitchell's throat was dry as he met Carter's gaze. The same man he had shoved into a patrol car, the same man he had ignored when he reached for his ID, and now the same man who had the power to decide his fate. Carter settled into his seat, adjusting his glasses before surveying the room. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then he spoke. "I have reviewed the charges and the evidence presented regarding the unlawful detainment of a civilian," he began, his voice steady. "A civilian who, as it turns out, was unlawfully profiled, restrained, and humiliated in broad daylight." His eyes flickered toward Mitchell, then Harris, by 2 officers who, I assume, believed they were untouchable. The room was so quiet that even the soft scratching of a journalist's pen could be heard. Harris swallowed hard. Mitchell's hands curled into fists beneath the table. He wanted to look away, to escape the judgment burning into his skin, but he couldn't. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the bench. I was not resisting. I did not match any real suspect description. And yet, I was detained. Why? He let the question hang in the air, his voice measured, but sharp. Mitchell opened his mouth, but Carter lifted a hand. Before you answer, Officer Mitchell, let's review your words that day. A screen lit up to the right of the courtroom. A video played. The crowd turned toward the screen. The footage, grainy but clear, showed the moment Mitchell and Harris had approached Carter on the street. The audio was crisp. Black male, dark suit, carrying a bag. The room tensed. A murmur spread through the audience. Harris sank lower in his chair. Carter let the video play a moment longer, before he tapped a button on his desk, freezing the screen. He folded his hands, his expression unreadable. "Tell me, Officer Mitchell," he said evenly, "do you know how many black men in this city wear suits and carry briefcases?" Mitchell's mouth was dry. Carter continued, his voice like a scalpel, cutting precisely where it hurt. "Do you know how many black professionals walk through the financial district every day? How many lawyers, doctors, businessmen? Or, let me put it more plainly, do you believe that, in a city of millions, you just happened to pick me by coincidence?" Mitchell inhaled sharply. A man in the back of the courtroom chuckled under his breath. The sound was small, but it carried. Carter turned his attention to Harris. "And you," he said, tilting his head. "You hesitated, didn't you?" Harris looked up, startled. "You knew something felt off. You weren't sure, but you followed orders anyway." Harris clenched his jaw. Carter's voice lowered, just enough to make the moment more intimate. "And tell me, Officer Harris, if I had not been a judge, if I had simply been another man in a suit, how would that day have ended?" Harris blinked rapidly, looking away. Carter let the question settle before shifting back in his seat. "The abuse of power is not simply in the act of wrongdoing," he said. "It is in the silence of those who know better, but choose not to act." Mitchell stiffened. Harris looked as though he wanted to sink into the floor. Carter exhaled, tapping a finger against the wooden bench. "The law exists to protect," he said, "not to serve as a weapon for those who think they are above it." He lifted his gavel. The final verdict was about to be delivered. The weight of the courtroom bore down on Mitchell and Harris like a crushing force. Every set of eyes in the room was locked onto them, some filled with quiet satisfaction, others with unfiltered disdain. The tension was suffocating, thick enough to choke on. Judge Carter exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against the polished wood of his bench. Then, he lifted the gavel, but he didn't bring it down. Not yet. "Before I issue my ruling," he said, his voice calm but razor-sharp, "I want to make something very clear." He turned his gaze to the crowd. "I am not standing here today as a judge seeking revenge," he stated. "I am standing here as a man who experienced, firsthand, what happens when those who are meant to serve and protect, instead, choose to humiliate and oppress." Mitchell shifted in his seat. His breathing was shallow, his mind racing. Carter's eyes locked onto him. "Officer Mitchell, do you realize the gravity of your actions that day?" Mitchell swallowed, struggling to find his voice. "Your Honor, I—" Carter held up a hand. "No justifications. No excuses. Just an answer." Mitchell clenched his jaw. A bead of sweat rolled down the side of his face. "Yes," he admitted finally, though the word tasted bitter. Carter nodded once before turning his gaze to Harris. "And you, Officer Harris. You hesitated. You knew something wasn't right, but you went along with it anyway." Harris opened his mouth, then closed it again. His fingers curled into fists. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor." For the first time, Something flickered in Carter's expression. Not sympathy, but something close to disappointment. "The difference between the two of you," he said, "is that one of you acted out of arrogance and the other out of fear. Neither is acceptable in a uniform." The room remained silent. The air was thick, almost electric, waiting for the inevitable. Carter inhaled deeply before lifting a single document from his desk. "I have reviewed the full case, the evidence, and the department's internal report." He tapped the paper against the desk once, setting it down. "And here is my ruling." Mitchell's pulse thundered in his ears. Harris's hands were shaking under the table. Carter's voice was steady, unwavering. "Officer Mitchell, for abuse of power, false arrest, and racial profiling, I am recommending your immediate termination and the commencement of an internal investigation into your prior arrests." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Someone whispered a stunned, "Damn." Mitchell's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Carter didn't pause. He turned to Harris. "Officer Harris, while your hesitation showed some level of moral conflict, you still failed to uphold justice in that moment. You will be placed on immediate suspension and required to undergo a full retraining program, including racial bias education." Harris closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the weight of those words. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Understood, Your Honor." Mitchell was still staring in disbelief. "You can't—" Carter's sharp gaze cut through him. "I can, and I have." A single deafening bang echoed through the courtroom as he brought the gavel down. It was over. The gavel's echo still lingered in the air, a final punctuation to the judgment that had just been handed down. Mitchell sat frozen, his face drained of its usual arrogance. His career, his authority, everything he had built his identity around, was crumbling before him. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder, murmurs of justice finally served, of a system that, for once, did not protect the wrong people. Mitchell's jaw clenched, but there was nothing left for him to say. No excuse, no argument. The law had spoken, and this time, he wasn't the one holding the power. Harris exhaled shakily, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. Suspension, retraining, the chance to do better, if he was willing to take it. Judge Carter stood, his robes flowing as he stepped down from the bench. He moved with the same quiet authority as always, but this time, there was something else in his expression. A lesson delivered, a reckoning complete. As he walked past the defendant's table, he paused just long enough for his voice to carry between them. "You thought I was invisible that day," he said evenly, his gaze locked onto Mitchell's. "But I was watching, and now, so is everyone else." Mitchell didn't move. He couldn't. Carter turned and exited the courtroom, the murmurs following him like an aftershock. The cameras, the journalists, they would spread this moment far beyond these four walls. By the time the doors swung shut behind him, Mitchell knew the truth. This wasn't just a courtroom ruling. This was the end of the life he had once known. Outside the courthouse, the city was just as busy as it had been that day on the street. People walked past, unaware of the reckoning that had just unfolded inside. But for those who had witnessed it, the world felt different. Judge Carter stepped onto the sidewalk, adjusting his cuffs. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the pavement. He took a slow breath, letting the weight of the moment settle. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about accountability, about making sure that the next time an officer thought about abusing their power, they would remember this case. Injustice didn't always happen in the shadows. Sometimes it happened in broad daylight, in front of everyone. The difference was whether or not people were willing to see it. A familiar voice broke his thoughts. "Your Honor." He turned. Harris stood a few feet away, his hands tucked into his pockets. His posture was tense, but his eyes no longer held the same nervous avoidance. Harris hesitated, then exhaled. "I should have spoken up." Carter studied him for a moment before nodding. "Yes, you should have." Harris looked down, but Carter continued. "But recognizing that now means you still have a choice. What you do with that choice, that's on you." Harris nodded slowly. Carter didn't wait for a response. He had said what needed to be said. As he turned and walked away, the world moved on around him. But the story wouldn't end here. People would talk about this case. They would share it. And maybe, just maybe, someone watching would think twice before assuming power made them untouchable. What do you think? Should officers like Mitchell be allowed back on the force? Or should there be stricter consequences for abuse of power? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you